The Manhattan skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 58th floor, each light representing dreams, ambitions, and fortunes won and lost. In the corner office of Stone Industries, Alexander Stone stood motionless, his silhouette cutting a sharp figure against the urban tapestry below. At 42, he had built an empire that stretched across technology startups, real estate developments, and investment portfolios worth billions. His name commanded respect in boardrooms from New York to Tokyo, whispered with a mixture of admiration and fear among Wall Street's elite. Alexander's morning routine was orchestrated with military precision. He arrived at the office at 6:30 sharp, when the building was still empty save for the cleaning crews finishing their night shift. His assistant Margaret, a woman in her 50s who had been with him for 8 years, would already have prepared his schedule, arranged his calls, and filtered through hundreds of emails that arrived overnight from different time zones. She knew his preferences better than he did himself. Ethiopian coffee, black, no sugar, served in a specific white ceramic cup that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The man himself was a study in controlled perfection. His suits were hand-tailored on Savile Row, each one fitting him like a second skin. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine every morning by the building's concierge service. His hair was precisely cut every 2 weeks by a barber who flew in from London specifically for this purpose. Every detail of his appearance spoke of power, wealth, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Yet despite all this outward perfection, there was something hollow in Alexander's gray eyes. He had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of and more, but somewhere along the way, he had lost something essential. The hunger that had driven him to build his empire had consumed everything else in its path, leaving behind a man who had everything money could buy, but nothing that money couldn't. His days blended together in an endless cycle of meetings, conference calls, and strategic decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. He made choices that could make or break companies, that could change entire industries, that could influence markets across the globe. But when he returned to his penthouse each evening, the silence was deafening. The penthouse itself was a monument to success and solitude. Spanning 3 floors of a prestigious Upper East Side building, it housed priceless artworks, rare books, and furniture that belonged in museums. Every room was decorated by renowned interior designers, every piece carefully selected to reflect taste and sophistication. Yet there were no personal photographs, no mementos from travels, no signs that a real person lived there, rather than just existed within its walls. Alexander's refrigerator was always stocked by a service, his meals prepared by a private chef who came and went without conversation. His laundry was handled by specialists, his cleaning done by a team that worked around his schedule to remain invisible. He had eliminated every mundane task from his life, every small human interaction that might slow him down or distract him from his empire building. His social life was equally sterile. Business dinners with potential partners, charity galas where his presence was expected, industry conferences where his opinions were sought after, but no genuine friendships, no romantic relationships, no connections that weren't somehow tied to advancing his business interests. He told himself that this was the price of success, that great achievements required great sacrifices. But in the quiet moments between meetings, when Margaret had gone home and the office building was empty except for security guards, he sometimes wondered if the price had been too high. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had built a communications empire while becoming increasingly isolated. His companies connected millions of people around the world, facilitated relationships, enabled conversations across continents. Yet he himself had no one to call at the end of the day, no one who cared whether he came home safely, no one who would notice if he didn't show up somewhere he was expected to be. Alexander had convinced himself that this isolation was temporary, that once he achieved the next milestone, closed the next big deal, expanded into the next market, then he would have time for personal relationships. But the milestones kept moving, the deals kept getting bigger, and the markets kept expanding. Success bred the need for more success, and the cycle seemed endless. As he stood at his window that evening, watching the city lights flicker to life below, Alexander Stone was the most successful man he knew, and the loneliest. He ruled a business empire but had no kingdom of his own, no legacy beyond profit margins and stock prices. He was a man who had everything and nothing, who had gained the whole world but lost something precious along the way, something he couldn't even name anymore because it had been so long since he'd allowed himself to feel its absence. The rain began to fall against the penthouse windows as Alexander settled into his leather armchair with a glass of 30-year-old whiskey. The amber liquid caught the light from the fireplace, casting warm shadows that seemed to dance with memories he had spent years trying to suppress. But tonight, something had loosened the careful control he maintained over his thoughts, and the past came flooding back with unprecedented clarity. 10 years ago, his life had been completely different. He was still ambitious, still driven, but there had been something else then. Someone else. Emily Hart had been a graduate student at the Institute of Fine Arts, working part-time at a small gallery in Greenwich Village while pursuing her master's degree in art history. She had wild chestnut hair that she never quite managed to tame, green eyes that lit up when she talked about painters most people had never heard of, and a laugh that could fill any room with warmth. They had met at a coffee shop near NYU, where Alexander had been working on his laptop trying to secure funding for his first major business venture. Emily had been at the next table, sketching portraits of other customers, completely absorbed in her work. When she accidentally knocked over her coffee cup, sending hot liquid streaming across his keyboard, most entrepreneurs would have been furious. But something about her mortified expression and immediate offer to pay for damages had charmed him instead. What began as coffee dates turned into long walks through Central Park, where Emily would point out architectural details on buildings that Alexander had passed 1,000 times without noticing. She introduced him to art galleries and independent films, poetry readings in basement cafes, and musicians performing in subway stations. Through her eyes, he saw a version of New York that existed beyond boardrooms and profit margins, a city full of creativity and passion and human connection. Emily had believed in his dreams when venture capitalists laughed him out of their offices. She had celebrated his small victories and comforted him through his failures. Her tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn had become his refuge from the pressures of building his business. In her presence, he could be just Alex, not the future mogul he was determined to become. The proposal had happened on the rooftop of their first shared apartment, a modest place in Queens that they could barely afford. Alexander had spent his last savings on a ring that was beautiful, if not extravagant, and Emily had said yes through tears of joy. For a brief, shining moment, he had envisioned a future where success and love could coexist, where building an empire didn't require sacrificing everything else that mattered. But success, when it finally came, proved to be a jealous mistress. The first major deal led to bigger opportunities, which demanded longer hours and more travel. Business dinners replaced quiet evenings at home. Weekend trips to scout new ventures replaced lazy Sunday mornings in bed. The ring on Emily's finger began to look increasingly out of place as Alexander's world expanded beyond anything they had imagined. The changes were gradual at first, missed dinners explained away by important meetings, canceled weekend plans justified by once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, phone calls cut short by incoming calls from investors. Emily tried to be understanding, tried to support his growing success, but Alexander could see the hurt in her eyes, even when she smiled and told him she was proud of him. The distance between them grew with each milestone in his career. As his bank account swelled, their conversations shrank. As his social circle expanded to include influential people and power brokers, Emily seemed increasingly out of place in his new world. She was still the same passionate, creative woman he had fallen in love with, but he was becoming someone else entirely. Someone who measured worth in dollars and saw relationships as networking opportunities. Their fights began as gentle disagreements about priorities and escalated into painful confrontations about the man he was becoming. Emily accused him of losing himself in his ambition, of forgetting the values that had once defined him. Alexander defended his choices as necessary sacrifices for their future together, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they rang hollow. The final argument had been brutal in its honesty. Emily had confronted him about missing her mother's birthday dinner for a business meeting that could have been rescheduled. She had accused him of caring more about impressing strangers than about the people who loved him. Alexander, exhausted from months of 16-hour workdays and the constant pressure to succeed, had lashed out with words designed to wound. He had called her naive for not understanding the demands of building something significant. He had suggested that maybe she wasn't suited for the life he was creating, that maybe their dreams had grown too far apart. He had watched the light fade from her green eyes as his words found their target, watched the woman who had believed in him realize that he no longer believed in them. Emily had left that night, packing her few belongings while Alexander sat in his study, too proud to apologize and too hurt to ask her to stay. She had placed her engagement ring on the kitchen counter along with a note that simply read, "I loved Alex. I don't know who you've become." For weeks after she left, Alexander threw himself even deeper into his work, using the pain of loss as fuel for his ambition. He told himself that heartbreak was temporary, but success was permanent, that he would thank himself later for choosing the harder but more rewarding path. He convinced himself that Emily had been holding him back, that her inability to adapt to his evolving lifestyle proved they were incompatible. But in the quiet moments when exhaustion finally forced him to stop working, he would find himself reaching for his phone to call her, only to remember that she was no longer there to answer. He would draft emails apologizing for his cruelty, explaining that the pressure had made him say things he didn't mean, begging her to give them another chance. But pride and fear of rejection always prevented him from sending them. As the months passed, Alexander's success grew exponentially, but the hollow feeling in his chest never quite went away. He dated other women, beautiful and accomplished women who moved in his social circles and understood the demands of his lifestyle, but none of them laughed like Emily. None of them saw the world with her wonder and passion. None of them had loved Alex instead of Alexander Stone, the billionaire. Now, 10 years later, as rain continued to streak down his penthouse windows, Alexander realized that every achievement since Emily left had been an attempt to fill the void she had created. Every deal closed, every company acquired, every billion added to his net worth had been his way of proving to himself and to her that he had made the right choice. But sitting alone in his magnificent apartment, surrounded by the trappings of incredible success, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. Le Bernardin was the kind of restaurant where reservations were made months in advance and where the wrong wine choice could mark someone as an outsider forever. The dining room hummed with the quiet conversations of Manhattan's elite, the soft clink of crystal glasses, and the almost reverent silence that accompanied truly exceptional cuisine. Alexander had chosen this venue specifically for its exclusivity and discretion, knowing that his potential investors from London would be impressed by both the setting and the difficulty of securing a table. Sir James Whitmore and his associate had flown in specifically for this dinner, representing a consortium of British investors interested in Alexander's latest venture into renewable energy. The deal they were discussing could inject £300 million into his company's expansion plans, money that would cement his position as a leader in the emerging green technology sector. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that had driven Alexander to cancel personal plans and rearrange his entire schedule. The conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine, touching on market projections, regulatory environments, and the long-term viability of various energy sources. Alexander found himself performing the familiar dance of high-stakes negotiation, revealing just enough information to maintain interest while protecting his proprietary advantages. Sir James was impressed by the thoroughness of Alexander's presentation, the sophistication of his technology, and the potential returns on investment. Alexander was in his element, discussing quarterly projections and 5-year growth strategies with the kind of passion that most people reserved for their hobbies or their families. This was what he did best, transforming complex business concepts into compelling investment opportunities, building bridges between vision and capital, creating wealth for himself and his partners through sheer force of intellect and determination. Then he saw her. Emily was seated at a corner table across the restaurant, and for a moment, Alexander thought he might be hallucinating. The woman he had spent 10 years trying to forget was less than 50 feet away, wearing a simple black dress that somehow made every other woman in the room look overdressed. Her hair was shorter now, styled in a sophisticated way that framed her face beautifully. and she carried herself with a confidence that hadn't been there when she was younger. But it wasn't just Emily's presence that stopped Alexander's heart mid-beat. Seated around her table were 3 children, and even from a distance, their resemblance to him was unmistakable. The oldest was a boy, perhaps 9 years old, with dark hair and the same piercing gray eyes that Alexander saw in the mirror every morning. Next to him sat a girl who appeared to be about 7, with Emily's chestnut curls but Alexander's stubborn jawline. The youngest was a little girl, maybe 5 years old, who seemed to be the perfect blend of both her parents. The realization hit Alexander like a physical blow. These weren't just any children, they were his children. The timing, the resemblance, the way Emily kept glancing protectively around the restaurant as if afraid of being recognized, all pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Somehow, somewhere in the fog of his memory, there had been encounters with Emily that he had dismissed as meaningless, moments of weakness that had apparently created the most meaningful thing in his life. Sir James continued talking about investment terms and partnership structures, but his words seemed to come from very far away. Alexander's attention was completely consumed by the family across the room, by the way Emily cut food for the youngest girl, by how the boy gestured animatedly while telling some story that made his sisters giggle. This was the life he had never allowed himself to imagine, the domestic happiness he had sacrificed in pursuit of professional achievement. The oldest boy looked around the restaurant with curious eyes, taking in the elegant surroundings with the same analytical gaze that Alexander used when evaluating business opportunities. The middle child was drawing on the back of a menu, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration, just as Emily used to do when she was working on her art. The youngest was chattering away, her animated expressions and gestures unmistakably familiar to anyone who had known Alexander as a child. Alexander's carefully constructed world began to crumble as he watched this scene unfold. Every assumption he had made about his life, every justification he had created for his choices, every rationalization about the price of success suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless. He had convinced himself that he was building something important, that his sacrifices were worthwhile because they served a greater purpose. But sitting across the room was evidence of something infinitely more important than any business empire, a family that existed because of him, but without him. The irony was overwhelming. He had spent the last decade building companies that employed thousands of people, creating technologies that improved millions of lives, generating wealth that supported countless families through pension funds and investment portfolios. But he had apparently failed at the most basic human responsibility of all, being present for his own children. Sir James noticed Alexander's distraction and followed his gaze across the restaurant. He made some polite comment about the lovely family at the corner table, noting how well-behaved the children were and how elegant their mother looked. His words felt like daggers to Alexander, who realized that to everyone else in the restaurant, Emily and the children were just another family enjoying dinner together. Only he understood the magnitude of what he was witnessing. The remainder of the dinner passed in a blur. Alexander managed to maintain enough focus to conclude the business discussion successfully, agreeing to provide additional documentation and schedule follow-up meetings. But his responses were mechanical, his attention constantly drawn back to the table where his unknown family was finishing their meal. He watched Emily help the youngest with her dessert, saw the older children discussing something with serious expressions, observed the easy intimacy of a family unit that had learned to function perfectly well without him. When Emily finally stood to gather her children and leave, Alexander felt a panic unlike anything he had ever experienced in a boardroom or negotiation. This might be his only chance to confirm what he suspected, to bridge the gap between his sterile existence and the vibrant life he had unknowingly helped create. The thought of letting them walk away without making contact was unbearable, but the thought of approaching them was terrifying. As Emily guided her children toward the exit, the oldest boy turned back to look around the restaurant one more time. For just a moment, his gray eyes met Alexander's across the room, and there was a flicker of recognition, not of identity, but of similarity. The boy tilted his head slightly, studying Alexander's face with the same intensity that Alexander was directing at him before Emily gently urged him toward the door. Alexander sat frozen in his chair, watching his family disappear into the New York night, knowing that his life had just changed irrevocably. The business deal that had seemed so important an hour ago now felt insignificant compared to the questions racing through his mind. How many birthdays had he missed? How many bedtime stories had he never told? How many moments of joy and discovery had happened without him? The weight of 10 years of absence pressed down on him as he realized that across town, 3 children who carried his DNA were probably brushing their teeth and getting ready for bed, completely unaware that their father was sitting in an expensive restaurant, finally understanding what he had lost and what he needed to find. Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he excused himself from the table, mumbling something about needing to make an urgent phone call. Sir James and his associate exchanged glances but nodded politely, accustomed to the demanding nature of high-level business. But Alexander wasn't thinking about business anymore. Every step across the restaurant felt like walking through quicksand, his legs heavy with the weight of a decade's worth of missed opportunities and unspoken truths. Emily noticed his approach before he reached their table. Her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, and she quickly whispered something to the children that made them sit up straighter and focus on their desserts. The years had been kind to her, Alexander observed, but they had also added a layer of protective steel to her demeanor that hadn't been there when they were together. She looked like a woman who had learned to depend only on herself, who had built walls not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. The children looked up at him with varying degrees of curiosity as he stood beside their table. The oldest, the boy who had to be Ethan, studied Alexander with an intensity that was both flattering and unnerving. His eyes were definitely Alexander's eyes, but there was something else there too. An intelligence and wariness that spoke of a child who had learned to be the man of the house too early. The middle child, a girl with Emily's artistic sensibilities evident in the way she held her crayon, regarded Alexander with polite interest. The youngest barely glanced up from her ice cream, more interested in the challenge of eating it before it melted than in the tall stranger who had appeared at their table. Emily's voice was carefully controlled when she spoke, her tone pleasant but distant, as if she were greeting a casual acquaintance rather than the man she had once planned to marry. She introduced him to the children as an old friend, someone she had known before they were born, and Alexander felt the inadequacy of that description cut through him like a blade. An old friend, not their father, not someone who should have been present for every important moment of their lives, just someone who had drifted in and out of their mother's past. The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of subtext and careful phrasing. Alexander asked polite questions about the children's ages, their schools, their interests, while Emily provided answers that were informative but revealed nothing about the deeper truth of their relationship. But with every detail she shared, Alexander's certainty grew stronger. Ethan was 9 years old, which meant he had been conceived just before or just after Alexander and Emily's final breakup. Sophia was 7, and Alexander had a vague, uncomfortable memory of a chance encounter with Emily at a charity gala around that time. Lily was 5, and there had definitely been that weekend in the Hamptons when they had run into each other at a mutual friend's house. Each revelation felt like another piece of a puzzle falling into place, creating a picture that was both beautiful and devastating. These weren't accidents or coincidences. They were the consequences of moments when Alexander had allowed himself to remember what he had lost, when longing had temporarily overcome pride and led him back to Emily's arms. But each time, he had walked away again, convinced that those encounters were mistakes, that getting involved with Emily again would only complicate his carefully ordered life. Ethan asked direct questions with the fearless curiosity of childhood, wanting to know about Alexander's work, his car, whether he lived nearby. Alexander found himself editing his answers, instinctively downplaying the extent of his wealth and success. Something about the way Emily watched him suggested that she wouldn't appreciate him overwhelming the children with displays of extravagance, and he realized he didn't want to be seen as just another rich man trying to buy his way into their affections. Sophia showed him her drawing, a sketch of the restaurant's interior that displayed a remarkable eye for detail and perspective. Alexander found himself genuinely impressed by her artistic ability, and when he complimented her work, her smile was so bright and genuine that it made his chest ache. This was his daughter, this talented, beautiful little girl who was looking at him with growing trust and interest, and she had no idea that he was anything more than a friend of her mother's. Lily, the youngest, was the most uninhibited in her acceptance of Alexander's presence. She chattered about her favorite foods, her stuffed animals, and her plans for the weekend with the kind of open enthusiasm that only very young children possess. When she asked if he wanted to see her loose tooth, Alexander found himself leaning forward with genuine interest, marveling at how something so mundane could feel so monumentally important. But underneath the surface pleasantries, Alexander could sense Emily's tension. She was watching him carefully, analyzing his every word and gesture, clearly trying to determine his intentions. When one of the children mentioned being tired, she immediately began gathering their things, sending a clear signal that this unexpected encounter was coming to an end. Alexander felt a desperation rising in his chest at the thought of them walking away again, of returning to his ignorance about their existence. As Emily helped Lily with her coat, Alexander made a decision that surprised even him. He asked if he could see Emily privately, just for a few minutes to catch up properly. The request hung in the air between them, heavy with 10 years of history and unspoken questions. Emily looked at him for a long moment, and Alexander could see her weighing the risks and benefits of prolonging their contact. Finally, she agreed, but only briefly, and only after the children were safely out of earshot. She arranged for the children to look at the restaurant's decorative fish tank near the entrance, a distraction that would keep them occupied, but still within her sight. Then she returned to the table where Alexander waited, and for the first time in 10 years, they were truly alone together. The air between them crackled with tension, unresolved emotions, and the weight of questions that demanded answers. Alexander knew that this moment would determine everything that came next. How he handled the next few minutes would decide whether he would have the chance to know his children or whether he would remain forever a stranger who had briefly entered their lives at a restaurant. The business skills that had made him successful seemed inadequate for this situation, where honesty and vulnerability mattered more than strategy and negotiation. Emily waited for him to speak, her green eyes steady and unreadable. She had learned patience in the years since they parted, the kind of patience that comes from single parenthood and the necessity of making careful decisions. Alexander realized that she held all the power in this moment, that his wealth and influence meant nothing compared to her role as the mother of his children. The question that had been burning in his mind finally found its way to his lips, simple and direct, and laden with the potential to change everything. Were the children his? Emily's response was equally simple, equally direct, but it shifted the ground beneath his feet in ways he was only beginning to understand. They were hers, she said, with a quiet pride that spoke of years of sacrifice and dedication and love given freely without expectation of recognition or support. But Alexander knew, as surely as he knew his own name, that they were also his, and that this knowledge would reshape every aspect of his carefully constructed life. The ride back to his penthouse passed in a haze of disbelief and dawning comprehension. Alexander sat in the back of his private car, staring out at the familiar streets of Manhattan without really seeing them. The city that had been the backdrop for his rise to power now seemed foreign, as if the revelation about his children had fundamentally altered the landscape of his existence. Every building, every intersection, every landmark looked different when viewed through the lens of fatherhood, a role he had never prepared for and never imagined he would need to embrace. His driver, accustomed to Alexander's preference for silence during evening commutes, navigated through traffic without attempting conversation. But Alexander was grateful for the quiet, needing space to process what had just occurred and what it meant for everything he thought he knew about himself. The business deal with the British investors, which had seemed crucially important just hours earlier, now felt insignificant compared to the magnitude of learning he had 3 children. The penthouse felt even more sterile and lifeless when he entered it that night. The carefully curated artwork, the expensive furniture, the panoramic views that usually filled him with satisfaction, all of it seemed hollow and meaningless in light of what he had discovered. He found himself walking through rooms he rarely used, seeing his home through new eyes and finding it wanting. Where were the family photographs, the children's artwork on the refrigerator, the toys scattered across expensive rugs? His home was a monument to success, but a mausoleum of human connection. Alexander poured himself a drink and tried to make sense of the timeline Emily had revealed. 3 children born over the span of 4 years, all conceived during brief encounters he had convinced himself were meaningless. He had compartmentalized those moments with Emily as lapses in judgment, temporary surrenders to nostalgia that he regretted almost immediately afterward. But now he understood that those encounters had been the most meaningful moments of the last decade, creating life even as he had walked away from responsibility. The weight of missed opportunities pressed down on him like a physical burden. 9 years of Ethan's life, 7 years of Sophia's, 5 years of Lily's, birthdays uncelebrated, scraped knees uncomforted, bedtime stories untold, Christmas mornings unshared. While he had been building his empire and accumulating wealth, his children had been taking their first steps, saying their first words, learning to read, discovering their talents and interests, all without knowing that their father existed. Alexander tried to imagine what their lives had been like without him. Emily raising 3 children alone, working to support them while nurturing their individual personalities and gifts. The boy, Ethan, growing up as the man of the house, probably feeling responsible for his mother and sisters in ways that no 9-year-old should. Sophia, with her artistic abilities inherited from both parents, perhaps wondering if her talent came from someone other than her mother. Lily, the youngest, accepting the absence of a father as normal because it was all she had ever known. The financial implications of his absence began to occur to him as well. Emily had been supporting 3 children on her own salary, providing for their education, their health care, their activities, and interests. Alexander's research team would undoubtedly provide him with detailed information about their living situation, but he could already guess that money had been tight, that Emily had made countless sacrifices to give their children the best life she could afford. Meanwhile, he had been spending more on a single business dinner than she probably earned in a month. But the financial aspects, overwhelming as they were, paled in comparison to the emotional cost of his absence. Alexander had grown up with a distant father himself, a man who prioritized business over family and measured love in terms of financial provision rather than personal presence. He had sworn he would be different if he ever had children, but he had managed to be even worse. Not distant, but entirely absent. Not emotionally unavailable, but completely unknown to his own offspring. The irony of his situation was almost unbearable. He had spent his entire adult life proving that he could succeed where his father had failed, building a larger empire, accumulating greater wealth, wielding more influence. But in the process, he had repeated his father's most damaging mistake on an even grander scale. His father had at least been present, even if emotionally remote. Alexander had managed to father 3 children without ever being a father to any of them. Sleep proved impossible that night. Alexander found himself researching child development, trying to understand what milestones he had missed and what his children might need from him now. He learned about the importance of father figures in children's lives, about the psychological impact of absent parents, about the challenges faced by single mothers. Each article he read felt like another indictment of his choices, another reminder of how completely he had failed in the most important responsibility he had never known he had. As dawn broke over the city, Alexander stood once again at his panoramic windows, but the view that usually energized him for the day ahead now seemed to mock his isolation. Somewhere across the city, his children were probably waking up, getting ready for school, eating breakfast prepared by their mother, who had been doing the job of 2 parents for nearly a decade. They would spend another day not knowing that their father existed, while he would spend another day knowing that the most important part of his life had been happening without him. The empire he had built suddenly seemed fragile and pointless. What good were billions of dollars if they couldn't buy back lost time? What value did business success have if it came at the cost of never knowing his own children? Alexander had always prided himself on being able to solve any problem, overcome any obstacle, achieve any goal through determination and strategic thinking. But he couldn't negotiate his way back into the past, couldn't acquire the years he had lost, couldn't merge his way into relationships that should have been built from the moment his children were born. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Stone faced a challenge that money and power couldn't solve, a problem that required qualities he wasn't sure he possessed: humility, patience, and the courage to admit that everything he thought he knew about success had been wrong. 3 days of sleepless nights and canceled meetings led Alexander to make a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. He dismissed his driver, left his phone in the penthouse, and took a taxi to Brooklyn to the address his private investigator had provided. The Hart Gallery was tucked between a vintage bookstore and a small cafe in Park Slope, its large windows displaying contemporary paintings that seemed to pulse with life and emotion in stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the art in Alexander's penthouse. Through the gallery window, he could see Emily arranging a new exhibition, her movements graceful and purposeful as she adjusted lighting and repositioned pieces to create the perfect visual flow. She had always possessed an intuitive understanding of how art should be presented, how to create spaces that invited contemplation and connection. Watching her work, Alexander was struck by how completely she had realized her potential, how she had built a life that reflected her values and passions, despite the challenges of single parenthood. The gallery itself was everything Emily had dreamed of when they were together. Intimate rather than imposing, focused on emerging artists rather than established names, designed to make art accessible to people who might never set foot in a museum. Alexander remembered her talking about creating such a space during their late-night conversations years ago, when her dreams had seemed impossibly ambitious, and he had been the one encouraging her to think bigger. Now, those dreams had become reality without any help from him. When Emily noticed him standing outside, her expression cycled through surprise, wariness, and finally resignation. She spoke briefly to her assistant, a young woman who looked at Alexander with undisguised curiosity, then came to unlock the door. The conversation that followed was careful and measured, with Emily maintaining professional courtesy while making it clear that she had not expected or necessarily welcomed his appearance at her workplace. Alexander requested a private conversation away from the gallery and its associations with Emily's professional life. After some hesitation, she agreed to meet him at a small coffee shop several blocks away, the kind of unpretentious place they used to frequent when they were younger and money was scarce. The irony was not lost on either of them that they were returning to their roots to discuss the consequences of how far they had traveled from those simple beginnings. The coffee shop was crowded with the usual mix of students, freelancers, and neighborhood regulars, providing enough ambient noise to mask their conversation while ensuring they remained in public view. Emily chose a table near the window, perhaps wanting the reassurance of escape routes and witnesses, and Alexander understood that she had learned to be cautious in ways that had never occurred to him during his privileged existence. When Alexander began to speak about his ignorance of the children's existence, Emily's response was swift and cutting. She had tried to contact him, she explained, not once but multiple times during her first pregnancy. She had called his office repeatedly, left messages with his assistant, even written letters that were never answered. Each attempt had been met with the polite but firm barrier that surrounded successful men like Alexander, the protective layer of staff and protocol that kept unwanted intrusions at bay. Emily described her growing desperation as her pregnancy progressed, and her attempts to reach Alexander continued to fail. She had stood outside his office building, hoping to intercept him between meetings, but had been turned away by security, who didn't recognize her and saw her as a potential threat to their employer's safety. She had attended charity events where she knew he would be present, but found herself unable to approach him in those settings, surrounded as he was by business associates and social climbers. The final attempt had come when Ethan was 6 months old, when Emily had gathered the courage to bring the baby to Alexander's office building and demand to see him. But by then, Alexander's success had created even more layers of protection around him, and his assistant had been instructed to handle all personal matters with polite but absolute deflection. Emily had waited in the lobby for 3 hours with a crying baby, watching well-dressed people come and go before finally accepting that Alexander had made himself unreachable. Each detail of Emily's account felt like a physical blow to Alexander, who began to remember the period she was describing through new eyes. He had indeed been obsessively focused on a major acquisition during that time, working 18-hour days and refusing to be interrupted by anything he deemed non-essential. His assistant had been instructed to filter out all personal calls and visitors, and he had trusted her judgment about what constituted a genuine emergency worthy of his attention. The tragedy of missed communication became clear as Emily continued her story. She had assumed that Alexander's refusal to see her or return her calls was a deliberate rejection, a clear signal that he wanted nothing to do with her or any complications that might arise from their past relationship. She had interpreted his silence as confirmation that she had been right to end their engagement, that he truly valued his career more than any personal relationships. Alexander tried to explain his perspective during those crucial months, his tunnel vision when it came to business opportunities, his assumption that Emily had moved on with her life just as he believed he had moved on with his. But his explanations sounded hollow even to himself, excuses rather than justifications for behavior that had caused immeasurable harm to people he should have protected and cherished. The conversation grew more painful as Emily described the years that followed, the struggle of raising 3 children alone while building her career and maintaining her dignity. She had never sought child support or legal intervention, not out of pride, but because she had convinced herself that Alexander's absence was better than his reluctant presence. She had seen how resentment could poison relationships and had decided that her children deserved better than a father who saw them as obligations rather than gifts. Emily's voice carried a decade's worth of accumulated hurt as she described explaining Alexander's absence to the children as they grew old enough to ask questions. She had crafted careful stories about their father being a good man who lived far away and had important work to do, stories that protected both their feelings and Alexander's reputation while slowly breaking her own heart. Each lie had been an act of love for children who deserved better and an act of protection for a man who had never asked for either. The weight of Emily's sacrifice became clear as she described the practical challenges of single parenthood multiplied by 3. The sleepless nights when children were sick, the parent-teacher conferences attended alone, the birthday parties where she had to be both mother and father, the moments of triumph and heartbreak that should have been shared but were instead carried in solitude. She had given their children everything she could while protecting them from the knowledge that their father had chosen not to be part of their lives. As their conversation continued, Alexander began to understand that Emily's strength had been forged in the fires of necessity, that her independence had been earned through years of having no one to depend on but herself. The woman sitting across from him was not the same person he had known 10 years earlier, but someone who had been transformed by responsibility and sacrifice into someone far more formidable than the girl he had once taken for granted. The coffee grew cold between them as they excavated a decade's worth of misunderstanding and missed opportunities, each revelation adding another layer to Alexander's understanding of how completely he had failed everyone who had ever mattered to him. The news of Alexander's children broke to his inner circle not through his own disclosure, but through the efficient intelligence network that surrounded wealthy and powerful men. His mother, Victoria Stone, received the information from her own sources within 48 hours of his coffee shop meeting with Emily, and her reaction was swift and merciless. The phone call that summoned Alexander to the family estate came with the kind of imperial authority that brooked no refusal, delivered in the tone Victoria reserved for matters that threatened the carefully constructed image of the Stone family legacy. The Stone mansion on the Upper East Side stood as a monument to old money and older values, its Georgian architecture and meticulously maintained gardens serving as a fortress against the changing world beyond its gates. Victoria had spent decades crafting the family's reputation, building on the foundation laid by Alexander's grandfather and reinforced by his father's more modest success. Every charity board membership, every social connection, every carefully orchestrated public appearance had been designed to position the Stones as representatives of American aristocracy. Alexander found his mother in the morning room, surrounded by newspapers and tablets displaying various social media feeds, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, and her expression carved from marble. She had clearly been monitoring the situation since learning about it, tracking any mentions of Alexander's name in connection with Emily or the children, calculating the potential damage to their reputation, and planning her response accordingly. Victoria's assessment of the situation was characteristically direct and devastating. The emergence of three unacknowledged children represented a scandal that could undermine everything the family had built over generations. The fact that the children's mother was essentially a working-class artist made the situation even more problematic from a social perspective, creating the kind of tabloid-ready narrative that could haunt them for years. Victoria had spent her life managing the Stone family's image, and she viewed Alexander's children as a threat to be neutralized rather than grandchildren to be embraced. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of Victoria's concern about maintaining social position and family reputation above all other considerations. She spoke about damage control strategies, about legal measures that could be taken to protect the family's interests, about the importance of ensuring that any acknowledgement of the children came with appropriate safeguards to prevent future complications. Her suggestions ranged from financial settlements designed to ensure Emily's silence to more aggressive legal tactics aimed at questioning the children's paternity. Alexander's attempts to explain his desire to know his children were met with cold pragmatism about the realities of their social position. Victoria reminded him of the family's obligations to their various business partners, charitable organizations, and social connections, all of whom expected a certain standard of behavior from the Stone family. She painted a picture of whispered conversations at country clubs, canceled invitations to important events, and business relationships strained by association with scandal. The maternal concern that Alexander had hoped to find was entirely absent from Victoria's response, replaced by the calculating mindset of someone who viewed personal relationships through the lens of their potential impact on family standing. She expressed no interest in meeting her grandchildren, no curiosity about their personalities or talents, no recognition that they might bring joy or meaning to her life. For Victoria, the children existed only as problems to be solved or threats to be managed. The business implications of his situation became equally clear when Alexander met with his longtime partner, Harrison Blake, later that week. Harrison's office in the financial district served as the nerve center for their various enterprises, its walls lined with monitors displaying real-time market data and communication links to their operations around the world. The conversation began with Harrison's characteristic directness about the potential impact of personal scandal on their professional relationships. Their company was in the final stages of negotiating the largest deal in its history, a complex international partnership that would inject over $1 billion into their renewable energy initiatives. The Asian investors who were driving this deal came from cultures that placed enormous emphasis on family stability and traditional values, and any hint of personal impropriety could derail months of careful negotiations. Harrison had already fielded subtle inquiries from their representatives about Alexander's personal life, questions that suggested awareness of the situation and concern about its implications. The timing of the children's emergence could not have been worse from a business perspective. Their company was also preparing for a public stock offering that would require intense scrutiny from regulators and investors, all of whom would want assurance that the company's leadership was stable and scandal-free. The discovery of three unacknowledged children would raise questions about Alexander's judgment, his character, and his ability to manage complex situations responsibly. Harrison's concerns extended beyond immediate business implications to the broader question of Alexander's priorities and decision-making capacity. If Alexander chose to pursue a relationship with his children, it would necessarily require time and emotional energy that had previously been devoted entirely to business interests. Harrison had built his own success on the assumption that Alexander's complete dedication to their company would never waver, and the possibility of divided loyalties represented a fundamental shift in their partnership dynamic. The pressure from both family and business associates created a suffocating environment where Alexander felt trapped between competing demands and expectations. On one side stood his mother and business partners, representing the world he had spent his entire adult life building and the responsibilities that came with extraordinary success. On the other side were three children he barely knew, but felt inexorably drawn to, and a woman who had shown remarkable strength in protecting them from exactly the kind of complications his world would inevitably bring. The weight of these external pressures was compounded by Alexander's growing awareness that his previous life had been built on a foundation of isolation and emotional sterility. The empire he had created required constant attention and absolute dedication, leaving no room for the messy complications of family relationships or personal growth. But the discovery of his children had awakened needs and desires he had suppressed for so long that he barely recognized them as part of himself. Late nights in his office became exercises in agonizing decision-making as Alexander weighed the competing claims on his loyalty and attention. Every choice seemed to require sacrificing something essential, either his children's chance to know their father or his company's stability and growth. The binary thinking that had served him well in business seemed inadequate for navigating the complex emotional and ethical dimensions of his situation. The external opposition he faced was not merely about money or reputation, but about fundamentally different visions of what constituted a meaningful life. Victoria and Harrison represented a worldview where personal sacrifice was justified by professional achievement and social position, where individual happiness was less important than family legacy and business success. But Emily and the children represented the possibility of a different kind of fulfillment, one based on human connection rather than material accumulation. As the pressure mounted from all sides, Alexander began to understand that his decision about whether to pursue a relationship with his children would ultimately define not just his future, but his understanding of what kind of man he wanted to be for the remainder of his life. Against the advice of his mother and business partners, Alexander made the decision that would begin to reshape his entire existence. He contacted Emily through the gallery, not with demands or expectations, but with a simple request that carried the weight of a decade's worth of regret. He wanted to earn the right to know his children. The conversation was brief and careful, with Emily maintaining the protective boundaries she had built around her family, while acknowledging that her children deserved the opportunity to know their father if he was genuinely committed to being present in their lives. The first official meeting was arranged with meticulous care, taking place at the Central Park Zoo on a Saturday afternoon when the children would be relaxed and in familiar territory. Alexander arrived early, having spent the previous night researching everything he could about 9-year-old boys, 7-year-old girls, and 5-year-old children in general. His usual confidence had been replaced by an unfamiliar nervousness as he contemplated the possibility of rejection from people whose opinion mattered more than any board of directors or panel of investors. Emily had prepared the children by explaining that her old friend Alex wanted to spend some time with them, carefully avoiding any mention of his true relationship to them while leaving the door open for future revelations. Ethan approached the meeting with the serious curiosity of a boy who had learned to be protective of his mother and sisters, asking direct questions about Alexander's intentions and background with a maturity that was both impressive and heartbreaking. Sophia was more reserved, watching Alexander carefully while staying close to Emily's side, her artist's eye taking in details that adults might miss. Lily, the youngest, was simply excited about the prospect of seeing animals and having a new adult to share her enthusiasm with. The afternoon unfolded with careful orchestration as Alexander found himself navigating the complex dynamics of trying to build relationships with children who had no reason to trust him. He discovered that his usual tools of persuasion, authority, wealth, and commanding presence were not only useless but potentially counterproductive with young people who valued authenticity over accomplishment. Instead, he had to learn to listen, to follow their lead, to show genuine interest in their thoughts and feelings without trying to direct or control the interaction. Ethan tested Alexander's patience and sincerity with a barrage of questions about his work, his lifestyle, and his relationship with their mother. The boys' protective instincts were clearly engaged, and Alexander found himself being evaluated by someone who had learned to be suspicious of adults who promised more than they could deliver. Rather than being annoyed by the interrogation, Alexander was impressed by Ethan's maturity and touched by his obvious devotion to his family. Sophia warmed up more slowly, but her breakthrough came when Alexander noticed her sketching the animals they were observing and asked genuine questions about her artistic process. Her face lit up as she explained her techniques and showed him details in her drawings that revealed a remarkable eye for observation and natural talent. Alexander found himself remembering Emily's similar passion for art and feeling a connection to his daughter that transcended their brief acquaintance. Lily was the easiest to win over, her natural exuberance and lack of protective barriers making her immediately accepting of Alexander's presence. She grabbed his hand as they walked between exhibits, chattered constantly about everything she saw, and seemed delighted to have another adult's undivided attention. Her innocent trust was both a gift and a responsibility that Alexander felt acutely, knowing that her openness made her vulnerable to disappointment if he failed to follow through on the implicit promises of his presence. The second meeting, arranged a week later at the Museum of Natural History, went more smoothly as the children became accustomed to Alexander's presence and began to see him as a reliable figure rather than a stranger. Ethan's questions became less challenging and more curious, as if he were trying to understand Alexander rather than test him. Sophia began to seek his opinion on her drawings and seemed pleased when he offered thoughtful observations about her work. Lily treated him like an old friend, expecting him to remember their previous conversations and including him naturally in her running commentary about everything around them. Alexander found himself learning lessons that no business school had ever taught him about patience, humility, and the art of building relationships based on trust rather than transaction. Every interaction with his children required him to set aside his usual need for control and efficiency, to accept their pace and priorities, to find joy in moments that had no measurable outcome or strategic value. The skills that had made him successful in business, quick decision-making, aggressive negotiation, ruthless prioritization, were not just useless, but actually harmful in the context of family relationships. The third meeting took place at Emily's house in Brooklyn, a modest but warm space that reflected her artistic sensibilities and practical needs as a single mother. Alexander was struck by how completely the house felt like a home, filled with the children's artwork, photographs from family trips, and the comfortable chaos that comes from people who actually live in their space rather than just occupying it. Every room told stories about the family's life together, revealing inside jokes, shared interests, and the deep bonds that had been forged through years of mutual dependence and affection. Watching Emily interact with the children in their natural environment gave Alexander a new appreciation for the magnitude of what she had accomplished alone. She moved seamlessly between helping Lily with a puzzle, reviewing Sophia's homework, and discussing a school project with Ethan, managing multiple demands with grace and patience, while making each child feel heard and valued. The ease with which she handled situations that would have overwhelmed Alexander spoke to years of practice and the deep emotional intelligence that comes from putting others' needs before your own. During dinner at Emily's kitchen table, Alexander experienced something he had never encountered in his adult life, belonging to a family unit where his presence was welcomed not for what he could provide or accomplish, but simply for who he was trying to become. The conversation flowed naturally between topics that ranged from Sophia's art class to Ethan's soccer team to Lily's upcoming kindergarten graduation, and Alexander found himself genuinely interested in details that would have seemed trivial just weeks earlier. As the evening progressed, Alexander began to understand that building relationships with his children would require a fundamental transformation in his priorities and self-perception. The instant gratification he was accustomed to in business dealings had no place in family dynamics, where trust was earned slowly through consistent presence and genuine care. The children were not impressed by his wealth or status. They wanted to know if he would remember their favorite foods, show up when he promised to be there, and care about their small victories and disappointments. The evening ended with Lily falling asleep on the couch next to Alexander while he read her a story, her small hand resting trustingly on his arm. The simple weight of her presence felt more meaningful than any business triumph he had ever achieved, and he found himself reluctant to move, lest he disturb her peaceful sleep. In that moment, surrounded by the gentle chaos of family life, Alexander began to glimpse what he had been missing and what he might still have the chance to gain. The crisis that would define Alexander's future arrived with the kind of perfect timing that seemed orchestrated by fate itself. On the same morning that Lily was scheduled to perform in her kindergarten spring concert, her first solo performance, which she had been practicing for weeks with the serious dedication that only a 5-year-old could bring to such an endeavor, Alexander received an urgent call from Harrison about the billion-dollar renewable energy deal that had been months in the making. The Asian investors had arrived in New York earlier than expected and were demanding an immediate meeting to finalize the terms of their partnership. Their representative made it clear that any delay could jeopardize the entire arrangement, as they had other opportunities competing for their attention and were operating under strict timelines imposed by their own boards of directors. The meeting was scheduled for the exact time that Lily would be standing on stage at her school, singing a song she had taught Alexander during their last visit together. Harrison's urgency about the meeting was compounded by troubling news about their competitors, who had apparently been working behind the scenes to undermine Alexander's deal by spreading rumors about his personal instability and questionable judgment. The emergence of his children had provided ammunition for business rivals who questioned whether a man who could father 3 children without knowing about their existence possessed the reliability and consistency required for such a massive international partnership. Victoria's influence was also clearly at work in the timing of the crisis. She had been pressuring Alexander to prioritize his business obligations over his newfound family responsibilities, and the coincidence of this crucial meeting occurring during Lily's performance seemed too convenient to be accidental. Alexander suspected that his mother had orchestrated the timing to force him into making a choice that would effectively end his attempts to build relationships with his children. The weight of the decision pressed down on Alexander as he stood in his office that morning, looking out at the city that had been the backdrop for all his professional triumphs. The billion-dollar deal represented more than just money. It was validation of his vision for the future of energy production, confirmation of his status as a leader in environmental innovation, and security for the thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on the continued growth of his company. Canceling the meeting would likely mean losing the deal permanently, as the investors had made clear their unwillingness to accommodate scheduling changes or delays. The ripple effects would extend far beyond Alexander's personal finances to affect pension funds that had invested in his company, environmental initiatives that depended on his funding, and the broader movement towards sustainable energy that he had helped to champion. But the thought of missing Lily's performance felt equally devastating in a completely different way. She had been practicing her song for weeks, her small voice growing stronger and more confident each time she performed it. She had asked Alexander specifically if he would be there to watch her, her eyes bright with excitement at the prospect of having her new friend witness this important moment in her young life. The promise Alexander had made to attend the concert represented something far more significant than a simple scheduling commitment. It was a test of whether he could prioritize his children's needs over his business interests, whether he had truly changed from the man who had once put career advancement ahead of every personal relationship. Missing this performance would confirm Emily's worst fears about his inability to be reliable when it mattered most. As the morning progressed, the pressure from both sides intensified. Harrison called repeatedly with updates about the investors' growing impatience and their threats to pursue other opportunities if Alexander didn't appear soon. Meanwhile, Alexander received a text from Emily with a photo of Lily in her costume for the concert, a simple white dress with paper flowers that she had helped to make, her face glowing with anticipation. The decision crystallized in a moment of absolute clarity that surprised Alexander with its simplicity. Standing in his office, surrounded by the symbols of his business success, he realized that he had spent his entire adult life building an empire that would ultimately be meaningless if he had no one to share it with who truly mattered. The billion-dollar deal, impressive as it was, would be just another transaction in a career full of transactions. But Lily's concert was a once-in-a-lifetime moment that could never be repeated or recovered. Alexander's choice, when he finally made it, felt both terrifying and liberating. He called Harrison to inform him that he would not be attending the investor meeting, knowing that this decision would likely cost him the largest deal of his career and potentially damage his reputation in the business community permanently. The stunned silence on the other end of the phone spoke volumes about the magnitude of what he was sacrificing and the impossibility of his partners understanding his reasoning. The drive to Lily's school took Alexander through neighborhoods he had never visited despite living in New York for decades, past small businesses and family homes that represented a completely different way of life from the one he had known. As he parked outside the elementary school, a modest building that served the diverse community of Brooklyn families, he felt a nervous excitement that eclipsed any anticipation he had ever felt before a major business presentation. The school auditorium was filled with parents and grandparents, siblings and friends, all gathered to celebrate the achievements of kindergarten students who had worked so hard to master simple songs and basic choreography. Alexander found Emily in the audience, saving a seat that she had hoped but not dared to expect he would fill. The relief and gratitude in her eyes when she saw him arrive made every consequence of his decision feel worthwhile. When Lily appeared on stage with her classmates, her face scanning the audience until she spotted Alexander, her resulting smile was radiant enough to light the entire room. The song she performed was simple and sweet, about friendship and growing up, but her clear voice and obvious pride in her accomplishment made it the most moving performance Alexander had ever witnessed. As she sang, looking directly at him with confidence and joy, he understood that this moment would remain precious to him long after every business deal had been forgotten. The choice Alexander made that day marked the definitive turning point in his transformation from a successful but isolated businessman into someone willing to prioritize human connection over professional achievement. By choosing Lily's concert over the billion-dollar deal, he declared his intentions not just to Emily and the children, but to himself and the world that had shaped his previous priorities. The aftermath of Alexander's decision rippled through his professional world with the devastating efficiency of a financial collapse. The Asian investors, insulted by what they perceived as a personal slight and convinced that Alexander lacked the focus necessary for such a massive undertaking, withdrew their offer permanently and signed with his primary competitor within the week. Harrison's disappointment evolved into something approaching betrayal as he realized that their partnership had been fundamentally altered by Alexander's new priorities, and he began exploring options for buying out Alexander's stake in their company. Victoria's reaction was swift and merciless, cutting off all communication with her son and making it clear through intermediaries that his choices had consequences that extended far beyond his immediate family. The social circles that had once welcomed Alexander now whispered about his apparent breakdown, his abandonment of responsibility, and his shocking prioritization of personal matters over professional obligations. Invitations to important events dried up, business relationships cooled, and the empire he had spent decades building began to show cracks in its foundation. But as Alexander's professional world contracted, his personal world expanded in ways he had never imagined possible. The children, initially surprised by his presence at Lily's concert, began to see him as someone who kept his promises, rather than just another adult who said one thing and did another. Emily, witnessing his sacrifice of something so important to him for the sake of their daughter's happiness, began to allow herself to believe that he might genuinely have changed. The weeks that followed established new patterns and rhythms in Alexander's life that bore no resemblance to the rigid schedule that had previously governed his existence. Saturday mornings were spent at Ethan's soccer games, where Alexander learned to cheer enthusiastically for small victories and offer comfort for minor defeats. Wednesday evenings became art sessions with Sophia, who patiently taught him techniques she had learned in school, while showing him a world of creativity and expression he had forgotten existed. Sunday dinners at Emily's house evolved into the anchor point of Alexander's week, the one commitment he refused to reschedule regardless of business pressures or social obligations. The simple ritual of sharing a meal with his children, hearing about their week, and contributing to the gentle chaos of family conversation became more meaningful to him than any board meeting or business dinner he had ever attended. The children's acceptance of Alexander into their lives was gradual but increasingly evident in small gestures and casual assumptions. Ethan began asking for Alexander's advice about school projects and friend conflicts, treating him as a trusted adult whose opinion mattered. Sophia started creating artwork specifically to show him, proud of his genuine appreciation for her talent and encouraged by his thoughtful questions about her techniques and inspirations. Lily's embrace of Alexander was the most complete and transformative, characterized by the wholehearted trust that only young children can offer. She began calling him by name without prompting, saving seats for him at school events, and including him in her plans with the assumption that he would want to be part of whatever adventure she was contemplating. Her uncomplicated love became a constant reminder of what authentic relationship could look like when stripped of agenda and expectation. The moment that marked Alexander's full acceptance into the family came on an ordinary Tuesday evening when Ethan, frustrated by a math problem that seemed impossible to solve, looked up from his homework and asked his father for help. The words slipped out naturally, without ceremony or announcement, as if it had always been there, waiting to be spoken. Alexander felt something shift fundamentally in his chest as he heard himself called Dad for the first time, realizing that he had been given the greatest title he would ever hold. Sophia's breakthrough came during one of their art sessions when she showed him a family portrait she had been working on secretly for weeks. The drawing depicted all five of them together: Emily, Alexander, Ethan, Sophia, and Lily, standing in front of a house with their arms around each other and genuine smiles on their faces. When Alexander asked about the inspiration for the piece, Sophia explained simply that she had drawn her family, including him without question or qualification, as if his belonging had never been in doubt. Lily's acceptance was perhaps the most moving because it was the least complicated. One evening, as Alexander was reading her a bedtime story, she interrupted him mid-sentence to announce that she was glad he lived with them now, even though he actually still maintained his penthouse apartment. When he gently corrected her assumption, she looked confused and asked why he wouldn't want to live with people who loved him. The innocent logic of her question stayed with him long after she had fallen asleep. Emily's journey toward trusting Alexander again was more complex and cautious, marked by careful observation of his consistency and genuine care for their children's well-being. She watched him navigate the challenges of parenting with patience and humor, learning from his mistakes and celebrating small victories with the dedication of someone who understood that he was being given a precious second chance. The conversation that finally addressed their future happened on a quiet evening after the children had gone to bed, when Emily and Alexander found themselves alone in her kitchen with cups of tea and the comfortable silence that comes from shared purpose. Emily acknowledged that she had seen fundamental changes in him, that his commitment to their children was evident in countless small actions and daily choices. She admitted that she had begun to hope for something she had thought lost forever: the possibility of building a life together based on who they had become rather than who they used to be. Alexander's response was careful and honest, acknowledging that he was still learning how to balance his professional responsibilities with his personal commitments, but that his priorities had been permanently reordered by the discovery of his children. He spoke about wanting to earn not just their love, but Emily's trust, understanding that both would require patience, consistency, and a willingness to put their needs before his own convenience. The house they eventually bought together in Brooklyn was smaller than Alexander's penthouse, but infinitely more alive, filled with the sounds of children playing, the smell of Emily's cooking, and the gentle chaos that comes from people who choose to build a life together. The walls were covered with Sophia's artwork, Ethan's soccer trophies, and Lily's school projects, creating a visual history of their family's growth and shared experiences. Alexander's business empire survived his changed priorities, though in a significantly altered form. He learned to delegate more effectively, to trust others with responsibilities he had once guarded jealously, and to measure success not just in financial terms, but in the quality of relationships he maintained with people who mattered. The companies he built became more sustainable and more humane, reflecting the values he had rediscovered through his children's influence. Years later, when business magazines wrote about Alexander Stone's transformation from ruthless mogul to family man, they would focus on the dramatic gesture of choosing his daughter's concert over a billion-dollar deal. But Alexander knew that the real change had been much quieter and more gradual, happening in moments when he chose to listen instead of speak, to be present instead of productive, to love instead of achieve. The greatest success of Alexander's life was measured not in dollars accumulated or deals closed, but in the trust of 3 children who called him Dad. The love of a woman who had given him a second chance he never deserved, and the knowledge that he had finally learned what truly mattered. In choosing his family over his empire, he had discovered that the greatest wealth was not what he could accumulate for himself, but what he could give to others who would carry his love forward long after his business achievements had been forgotten.